Welcome to the Zero Waste Asia Newsroom. I'm Sonia Sudillo, Gaia Global Climate Communication Officer, covering the final round of negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty, or INC-5. With COP29's climate financing discussions fresh in mind, civil society organizations, especially in the Global South, emphasize the urgent need for sustainable and equitable funding mechanisms to ensure the treaty's effective implementation. The recently concluded COP29 faced heavy criticism for advancing carbon markets that favor polluters while allowing wealthier nations to evade their responsibilities to support developing countries. Critics argue that this reflects a long-standing strategy by actors like the US and the EU to avoid binding commitments, leaving developing countries without the necessary financial resources to address climate and environmental crises. INC-5 must avoid these missteps by securing robust funding mechanisms that address the root causes of plastic production, plastic pollution, prioritize reuse system, and uphold principles of justice and sustainability. These negotiations are critical for crafting a globally harmonized and truly effective policy response. Joining me today is Gaia Asia Pacific's Plastic Policy Officer, Arpita Bagat. Hi, Arpita, how are you?
A little cold, but otherwise doing good.
Okay, boost on his goal. So, Arpita, let's start by reflecting on the first day of INC-5. What stood out to you and any striking statements from the first plenary?
Yeah, so the plenary is live stream and plenary is going on right now. There was a break for lunch, and after that it was supposed to resume at 3, but it actually started at 4, and now it's almost 5 p.m. Korea time. Basically, it started with some really shocking attempts from a certain like-minded group of countries, and you can see the plenary who first tried to bring up the agenda on rules of procedure. If you go to the agenda for this INC, I think Rule 3C is the rules of procedure, which have been in operation as draft rules of procedure, and the basically the contentious rule is Rule 38, which is about decision making, whether it happens via voting and or by consensus. And folks who've been listening to us since the beginning of INCs know that consensus will allow one country veto, so one country can pretty much stall the negotiations, and which is what we saw in INC2 in Paris. We also saw that in Nairobi in INC3. And INC4, the new chair, Ambassador Louis Bias, tried to not have that issue come up. But similarly, this time that issue came up, was raised very, very soon, within the first hour or so after all the statements from the ministers from Korea, including the president and the chair and the head of UNEP, Inger Anderson. This issue was raised pretty quickly, and then it was followed by other countries, the likes of Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Bahrain, trying to bring it back to the forum and trying to essentially delay the progress in terms of acceptance of the agenda and moving forward, towards substantial negotiations. So we lost quite some time on that. But then, of course, it was reiterated that we are still having draft rules of procedure with the interpretative statement that was applied way back, I think, at INC2. You all might have seen it, but basically it says that there is no agreement necessarily on the decisions that are made unless they are agreed by all. And so there is room to use it. But if this is the last INC, which some countries will push for it to be, and we are left with no voting coming up, then we will be setting the precedent of consensus-based decision-making. However, we should know that once the INC, the negotiations are over, and then there's an interim period of about a few years where discussions around setting up governance bodies, discussions around getting more scientific evidence and deciding on different kind of annexes and more such nuances are developed, there would also be discussion around the rules that will apply for COP. So the rules that will apply for COP would be different from the rules that we have. I mean, the idea is to have the same template, but of course we want voting-based decision-making to still remain. Otherwise, you know, Sonia will be in the same position as with Paris Agreement and the COPs that we have seen over the last many decades, in fact, in the climate negotiations. So that was one of the big issues that was brought up. After that, right now, I just for our viewers to know briefly, by the end of INC-4, the text that was developed was called compilation text or compilation draft, and it was about a 70-odd page document with more than 3,500 brackets. The brackets indicate lack of agreement. And so I think the chair was in a difficult space to figure out how to work with those brackets, because if you have to make that draft as the final treaty text, final text of this new agreement on plastic pollution, you have to get rid of the bracket. Otherwise, you know, you have nothing. And even things like plastic pollution were bracketed, things like life cycle approach was bracketed. A lot of countries had included zero option as an addition text under many provisions, especially the upstream provision around reduction of plastic polymer production, chemicals, and so on. And so basically to kind of bypass or sort of find a resolution to this problem, the chair started this process of introducing non-paper. It's a non-paper because it's something that's not really officially accepted as basis of negotiations even yet. Right now, that's what's happening. Certain countries are sticking to the guns and say that compilation text needs to be the basis, or at least compilation text, you know, which was developed through 4 negotiation meetings and through a lot of discussions and streamlining of text also happened in the last INC, should at least be referred to and should have the language borrowed to the non-paper. And the non-paper went through like 3 rounds of discussions, most of it online, which excluded a lot of countries. So I was just talking to a few of the Asian countries, and they raised they did make statements. Vietnam and Sri Lanka just made statements about 20 minutes back about not being happy about compilation text, you know, being not used for negotiations. Like, we don't want to be in a situation where compilation text, which has had so much work done, is just thrown out of the door. And the non-paper itself, the now it's non-paper 3rd version, was developed, but there was no inclusion of civil society. There was no submissions that countries were able to make. It was all basis of discussions. And right now it's available on the INC-5 webpage. You can find it. It is not a very good document to see. It has a lot of voluntary language. It does not have primary plastic production is totally out now. It is all falling under supply. There is no dedicated provision on trade. In the second version, the second version of non-paper, there is no provision on just transition. And you know, these are all very much priorities of Gaia as a movement. And so we are in a difficult space because non-paper is really not a good document. But at the same time, we know that we need to negotiate. We know we need to have some negotiation. So between, you know, early May or April when INC-4 concluded in Ottawa, and now we are, I don't know what the date today is, but it's November, towards the end of November, there have been a lot of meetings, a lot of which we were not part of as civil society. There was also the intersessional meetings that happened in August, which did not allow civil society participation, but they discussed financial mechanism, and they discussed chemicals of concern in plastic products. And the reports are available online. But the hope was that some of the content from those discussions, which were had over, I think, 2 to 3 days, would be reflected in the chair's non-paper. But that's not the case. So a lot of the financial mechanism discussion, for example, where African group, for instance, have been pushing for a dedicated fund that prioritizes the needs of developing countries, economies in transition, and that ensures that the producers pay. None of that language is reflected in non-paper. The non-paper is kind of going as a prejudice towards private financing. And we know private financing, if it had to solve the plastic problem, we wouldn't be here in the first place. And please visit Gaia's social media channel, Gaia Zero Waste Asia social media channel. We also talk about the problem with plastic credits, which came up quite a lot in the discussions. There are also events here. There was an event yesterday about plastic credits, and they continue to be brought up. And we are really worried because, well, go to that post and look at, you can read it in details, but just to cut the story short, essentially, we of course welcome private financing, but private financing cannot have accountability. Credits essentially is a way for polluters to keep polluting by paying a certain fee. And plastic itself, and we've seen the failure with carbon credits, but plastic itself is a complex material. Different kind of plastics have different material and chemicals involved, have different impacts. And essentially, the point of the matter is we are still looking at the downstream. Credits only look at the downstream part. And there are so many other similar schemes, outcome-linked bond. Basically, it's called concessional finance that lets polluters get away with things. And more than that, what's even more problematic is that while all of this show up, there is very little consideration of reuse and the funding for reuse. We want a zero waste world. We need funding for reuse, and we have enough evidence. From the Circulate Initiative's investment tracker, only 4% of all investments ever made have gone into reuse and refill. And that speaks to itself. Like private financing, why would it fund reuse? Because reuse will essentially make their jobs unnecessary after a long time, because they get subsidies, huge amount of subsidies to use plastics, especially plastic packaging, which is totally unnecessary. Asia has shown the way, and that's something that we have talked about enough. Also, shout out to Gaia AP, because we'll be releasing Reuse in Asia compendium based on all of our members' work piloting reuse across Asia, reuse packaging. I think that event is on November 27th, so please watch out for that. And so we are right now in a very shaky grounds. The non-paper also has a lot of language around national capacities and capabilities, which is, again, a way to dilute it. There is no provision on reuse. Everything is put into this provision on plastic product design, which has everything from reusability to refillability to repurpose to remanufacture, this term that has not existed so far. So new terms have come up, and so far we've not defined any of the terms. So we are still not there yet, but there has to be, we have to look at the language of the treaty text very carefully in terms of what does it mean when it comes to legal compliance, when it comes to, actually having legally binding language. So, if you have a lot of encouraged to, parties are asked to have effective measures, we need to be clear about what those measures are. So we need to see a lot more shall, a lot more not just encouraged to, but are asked, shall comply with, that kind of legally binding language that makes sense. So it's great that there is a legal drafting group that's been set up for this round of INC. You can see the list of legally drafting groups experts, and it's available on the INC-5 website. And another big news for Asia Pacific, I don't know how many of you read our newsletter, but we shared some of this information. So Asia Pacific region is chaired by Jordan and Japan. In the past 4 INCs, very recently in the last month, Jordan announced that they would be stepping away from their position as co-chair, and today we find out that Saudi Arabia has been made the chair of INC. So now we see things in terms of civil society engaging with this Asia Pacific Bureau, which has been difficult always, things getting even more difficult. And I can vouch for that. So far, we've had no opportunity to engage with Asia Pacific group, but we are hoping that there would be one. But now that Saudi has become the co-chair, it's unlikely to be so. So not the easiest region to be working in, but we have to keep hope alive because we also have the small island developing states who are championing progress. Back to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Orpita. So before that, can you give us a refresher of what transpired at INC-4 and between INC-4 and 5, and how is this influencing this round of negotiations? I'm actually especially curious about this, what do you call it? The non-paper. Who developed this non-paper? Where did this come from? This is very new for me.
Yeah, it's new for me also. It's called a non-paper because it's not officially accepted as for negotiations. It's not an official paper that has come out from Secretariat. It's something that it's called chair's non-paper. That means the chair has, worked with countries to develop some text that would be shorter, that would be more concise, that could be, used to have negotiations. And like I said, some countries are not in favor of non-paper because they do feel that they were excluded, and they were excluded, or at least their voices are not showing up in the text. And a lot of countries are asking for compilation text to still be somehow used. So we don't know what will happen, or maybe something has happened inside and I'm out. But we are hoping that there will be some kind of a middle ground where, some language, some text is borrowed from the compilation text and non-paper, or some combination of that. But right now, I don't have a clear answer. I think that answer we will have tomorrow, hopefully, because the plenary has not concluded. Hopefully the plenary concludes today, because if it doesn't, then we will probably have another plenary tomorrow, and that's again waste of time because we need to get to negotiations. Another interesting thing I want to mention, it was made clear in the very beginning, even in UNEP official documents, that they would want to focus on statements made on behalf of regional groups, even like in terms of observers, sort of alliances. But what we see now is a lot of countries have been making statements individually as well. So that takes a lot of time, right? And we are running out of time. We have, as the chair has repeatedly said, about 63 hours. I have not calculated because what I imagine would be a lot of midnights here. And to just quickly round up on what happened at INC-4 is, so INC-4 was the first time where actual discussions, negotiations happened, but we had some streamlining of text and some cleanup, you remove repetitions and things like that. But in terms of actual agreement, we didn't have any, right? Like we have so many brackets that just shows that there has been no agreement and no voting was called. And this is the problem with consensus-based decision-making alone. While consensus encourages government to come together, it's in favor of diplomacy, international diplomacy. But having no option of voting at all means that the government who do not want that particular agreement to be progressive, or that agreement to be enacted, can raise objection and can reopen the entire discussion again, and then we have a stalemate. That means we wasted time. So that's where we are.
Thanks, Arpita. Arpita, recently civil society expressed concerns with a letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez regarding public statements by UNEP Executive Director Ms. Inger Anderson. Can you throw some light on why this action was taken?
Yeah, so last few months have been so much, COP has happened, Inger Anderson was there also and made some statement. The chair was also there, if I'm not wrong. Before that, there was the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, and that followed up with the New York Climate Action Week. I think that's all in September, October period alone. So a lot has happened, and Miss Anderson has been making statements which have really dialed down on ambition, which is shocking because when we started, I remember at INC-2, I didn't attend INC-1, but I remember her first statement in INC-2 was very strongly on this agreement has to address plastic across the full life cycle of plastics, and the full life cycle starts at extraction and ends at disposal. But if you see her statements in recent times, it's very much focused on we will, and she made similar statement this morning as well. She made similar statement at COP, where there was a discussion around finance for plastic pollution. She made a similar statement at Climate Week, and it was really shocking because she's talking now about phasing out certain chemicals, the hazardous chemicals and the hazardous plastics, which is very different from closing the tap, right? The UNEP itself started the discussion on closing the tap. Her first statement was about closing the tap, and you can't close the tap if you just want to clean up or if you just want to limit, certain plastics. So there is a lot of shift in the tone and the approach. There was also an observers meeting. It's a formality that happens before every INC. There was a 1-hour meeting yesterday. I was not there, but it was quite disappointing because the civil society did raise concerns around their exclusion in intersessional meetings in this whole non-paper development process. And in terms of, what is considered, what is included in the textual recommendations that have gone into the chair's non-paper, many such things. And the response again was very dismal. It was very apolitical. It was very like, I talk to everyone, but we know you're talking more with the industry, and that's a little bit concerning. So those statements have worried us. They continue to worry us, and the Civil Society Coalition responded with this open letter. It's available, it's still active on Plastics Treaty Coalition website. It was endorsed, if I'm not wrong, by 170 organizations and alliances, including Gaia. So I think that's about it. Back to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Rita. What are the outcomes that CSOs like Gaia are pushing for at INC-5, given all these changes in what they are saying there now?
So this is a question we've been answering since the first INC, right? What are the outcomes? What do we want? And we know what we want. Right now, we are at a defining moment where we are talking about the minimum that we want to get away from INC-5, and what can be delayed for later, because we need at least the structure of the treaty to have some strong language and to ensure that it includes provision on production reduction. It actually phases out chemicals. It actually enshrines just transition and human health and human rights principles. And it's not just about, national circumstances, nationally determined plans. We don't want NDCs like we have in the climate space for plastics, because we know that's never going to work. And we don't want legitimization of polluting technologies like chemical recycling, waste to energy incineration, plastic credits, loopholes like plastic credits. And this treaty could define what safe waste management means. There's a provision of environmentally safe waste management, but we've never discussed what that actually means. So we need the structural components to be had right. We need to ensure they are there before the treaty goes into signing and then ratification. And we know that the details, like initial list of chemicals, priority polymers that need to be eliminated, and then which are non-essential, and then essential plastics which can be replaced by better material, things like that. The Nordic Council's report on essential use criteria that the scientific coalition also supports. Those kind of details can come later. Those kind of details would also require a strong scientific body which is free of conflict of interest, and so far that's not been the case, unfortunately. In the negotiation, the process has been really difficult from the very beginning, from access issues in the building to lack of transparency in having information in terms of what's going on. So we are really focused on ensuring that these provisions on production, on chemicals, on just transition, strong finance, these are there in the treaty. And the treaty does not legitimize false solutions. And then the details can be added through annexes. But we know that if, for example, production reduction, primary plastic production reduction is not in the treaty text and it's finalized at this INC, which is last scheduled INC, then we know that it cannot be added, because amendment to a treaty in the COP is it's very difficult, and it's a near impossibility to have a provision added. You can improve, you can keep on adding those lists of polymers you want to phase out and chemicals, and you could have amendments. You could have countries, trying to get their exemptions, right? But exemptions, but those kind of things can come later. We right now need to have this structure right, and if we don't have this structure right, then we are well, we will continue to have plastic pollution. Let's just say that.
So, transparency and equitable participation are some of the issues that Global South has faced in the negotiation process since the very beginning. Could you elaborate on whether there's been progress made on this?
Yeah, I mean, Sonia, you've been with me on this journey. I think you also are aware of pretty much a lot of it. It hasn't been. It's just the forms have changed. It's not just the observers, like civil society, being excluded. It's also the perspectives and voices of low-income countries and the most affected countries being excluded. And the non-paper is almost like the evidence of that. If we go back to even the intersessional reports and what it contains, and we look at the non-paper, what it contains, you will realize yourself that a lot of the strong language that ambitious countries who are most affected, like the small island developing states or the African group, that language just does not show up in the non-paper. It's very voluntary, it's very non-binding. And the African group has been like fighting for their place in the negotiations from the very beginning, and their frustrations are increasing. They asked for, meetings to end by 10 p.m. because they're smaller delegation. It's a similar problem with a lot of the Asian low-income countries as well. We continue to have this problem. Like I said before, these low-income countries, some of them, there have also been a lot of elections. There was unrest in Bangladesh in the last few months. There was re-elections, general election in Sri Lanka. There were elections in Indonesia. There were elections in New Zealand. Just in our region this year that I'm aware of, there are probably so many other changes that we are not aware of. We are living in a very, very fragile, unpredictable world, and a lot of that is because of crossing triple planetary boundaries. So in all of this context, I think equity and access is something that is fundamental to any kind of process. UN has on its own a public participation rule that they follow, but again, in my experience, they haven't really followed it as much as they've talked about it. And eventually, even the frontline and fence line communities were excluded, right? Forget the rest of us. Intersessional meetings have not included them. And now it's like head of delegation meetings were had for non-paper, which is very small number of people. There are countries who are non-native English speaking. A lot of the intersessional meetings and the discussion on non-paper, the head of delegation discussion to develop non-paper, they did not have translation facilities. They did not consider non-native English speakers. They did not consider countries that lack access. They did not provide funding to a lot of the countries. A lot of the countries don't even know right now who are here that this kind of process happened. So there are countries who are landing up at INC-5 and realizing that there is a non-paper. So we are also trying to get countries to understand what is happening and how it has happened, and trying to support them in having clear positions. So that's unfortunately where we are, Sonia.
Thanks for repeating. Just so we don't end in a very sad, melancholic tone, so tell us about the march that happened. It was yesterday, and tell us
Oh,
about
yes.
the delegation that is with you at, in Busan.
Oh, we have the largest Asia Pacific delegation in Busan, and we had the most amazing march on the 23rd. There is this way leads directly ahead, leads to the Olympic Park in Busan, and oh my God, it was a fair. It was full of colors. There were young people, there were youth activists, there were old activists, there were people talking about health, there were people talking about chemicals, there were people. And even this morning when I reached Pexco, there was a set of Korean civil society groups who were demanding action. And there were at least 1,500 people who marched on 23rd. And that's a big number in a country like Korea to get the permissions in place. So kudos to Break Free from Plastics and Greenpeace Korea and Uproot Plastics and all of its members. And we know Uproot Plastics came together only early this year, and they've managed to pull together this mega force. And I felt really proud to be an Asian among all of them, and get a chance to make a statement in front of those hundreds of people. It was an absolute privilege to represent the voices of our amazing members who are really the power. And it was so energizing. It just made us have a good start. And we know that that our voices reached the people that they were supposed to reach. We know that for a fact. We know we were heard. The march itself was covered by so many Korean media outlets. It was also covered internationally. The petition that Greenpeace had has also been endorsed by, I think, over 1 million odd people. The petition that was delivered yesterday to the Fijian and Brazilian delegation at the evening meeting that WWF hosted with Greenpeace. So the world is listening, Sonia, and there is absolutely no doubt about that. The leaders are watching us. They know what we want, and they know why we want it. We have enough science to support what we are saying. We have the waste picker communities, the indigenous peoples right here, demanding just transition to actually be real just transition and to prioritize their needs. Even the just transition article is very, very poorly written in non-paper, by the way, and it requires so much more work, and hopefully this will be discussed in a proper way. We have countries like Australia that I hope are going to champion indigenous people's voices, and many others. So there is still hope. We have heard changes in certain governments that I will not name. But I can assure you that I will have good things to say tomorrow. It's also the months and months of, sort of working constantly, me and all of my members who have been working with me and have been responding to my late night messages and sometimes just unplanned calls and 1 million emails from me that are marked confidential. So I also want to give a shout out to all of our Asia and Pacific members who have been standing tall with us all through the way, and the pictures from and the videos from the march speak for themselves. And we have a lot of members making strong statements in many events that will be happening and fighting false narratives. So we are strong, and we will keep fighting.
Thank you so much.
Back to you,
Arpita.
Sonia.
So yes, the world is listening, and I like what you said. You're still proud to be an Asian, no? So thanks, Arpita, for guiding us through the opening session of the INC-5 and what lies ahead this week. For updates on the ongoing negotiations of the Global Plastics Treaty, follow our Zero Waste Asia Newsroom and Zero Waste Asia News Breaks on our social media platforms, Zero Waste Asia on Instagram and YouTube, and Gaia Asia Pacific on Facebook and LinkedIn. This is Sonia Sudillo. Join us again tomorrow as we bring you the latest from the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations. Thank you.